Okay, we're just going to start letting everybody in here from the waiting room. We're going to give it about a minute or so until we get started. Hello for everybody who's just coming in now. We're going to wait another minute. We'll get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining. All right. It is now 10 o'clock, so I think we are good to get started here. Welcome to this week's webinar. As you can see, our topic is understanding the role and impact of customer-specific requirements on your QMS. Let's get started with our introductions here then. I'm Maddie. I'll be your moderator today. Our guest speaker today is Marcus Vivone, the Director of International Development with Plexus. He's the IATF Master Trainer and an IAQG Master Trainer as well. A learning and examination processes lead designer, as well as a supply chain and continuous improvement lead designer. And he's got a master's in business admin from the University of Sao Paulo. And I'm just going to let him say hi here now.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people around the world. Welcome. So today we are going to cover the customer-specific requirements, particular in 4 key areas. That's our agenda: interpreting the CSRs, integrating, maintaining, and auditing CSRs. So we're going to cover an overview, obviously an overview of these 4 critical areas to ensure customer satisfaction in automotive supply chain: interpreting the understanding of the CSR scope and intent, integrating into your quality management system, maintaining, and then how to audit for effective implementation. So that's our agenda. So we'll be starting with a poll.
Yes, we're just going to have a very quick poll to kick us off here. There's only 3 questions, so if I could get you guys to get started with this. So we want to know what tier you represent in the supply chain. We would like to know what you find to be the most consistent struggle in complying with CSRs, as well as what you consider to be the biggest challenge in getting your CSRs met. So it looks like I've got a couple people starting to join in participation. I'm going to keep this poll up until I see some of you guys are participating here. This is a good way to stay engaged, a good way to give us some information here before we get started so that we can really tailor these webinars to our audience. We want to make sure we're giving you guys useful information that's going to be helpful to you. And so this is one of the best ways that we can get that information. Looks like we've got a good mix of answers here. That's awesome. Just going to give it another couple seconds here, and then we'll end the poll and share our results. Of course, this will be anonymous for you guys. All right. So as you can see here, what tier do you represent in the supply chain? We've got about 53% at tier 1, about 14% in OEM, 34% tier 2 or below. Looks like the most consistent struggle everybody is finding here is figuring out which ones are most applicable. It's about 44%. And then pretty even mix with finding to be the biggest challenge. Looks like suppliers not understanding the intent seems to be an issue here. So this is great. Thank you guys for that. So before we kick off here, just want to let you know that we do have a Q&A feature that we'll be looking at towards the end of the webinar here. So please feel free with any questions you might have to pop them in there, and we will see what we can get answered at the end of the webinar session here today. Otherwise, I'm going to go dark here for a little bit, and I'm going to let Marcus kick off and get us started.
Thanks, Maddie. Well, all right, we have a good mix here. So as we mentioned, we are going to cover 4 main topics. As we finish each stage of this webinar, feel free to use the Q&A and ask your questions. So interpreting CSR. So let's go do some basics here. The first thing is really to make sure we understand the differences between customer requirements and customer specific requirements. So IATF in Section 3 define customer requirements as all types of customer requirements, right? So it's very broad, generic, right? Technical, commercial, product and manufacturing related requirements, general terms and conditions, including CSRs. Okay, for the sake of timing, I'll call for now on CSRs, customer specific requirements. So what are customer specific requirements? Are requirements that are supplemental to the IATF requirements. So example, so if you have a GM engineering drawing, that's a customer requirement, right? Because it's a technical requirement. But if you have Stellantis requirement to cascade down quality objectives to sub-suppliers, according to clause 6221, now this is a customer-specific requirement because it's a supplemental requirement based on the automotive standard IATF 16949. So that's just level setting information. CSRs are not all types of requirements, are just quality management system supplemental requirements to IATF, right? Talking about supplemental, if you think about the hierarchy of QMS requirements and you see this pyramid, on the base, you have the ISO 9001 applicable to any industry. Those are generic requirements across the board that are incorporated into IATF 16949. Now, remember, IATF 16949 does not contradict the ISO 9001, but just provide additional quality management system requirements that are valid for all automotive OEMs, right? All automotive subscribers of IATF recognize it that we do have sector requirements. And then you have on top of that the CSRs. So a typical example on ISO 9001, they talk, for example, in 851, the organization needs to control production, and this includes provision of this production under controlled conditions. Very generic, right? IATF on 8511 will talk about the development of control plans. So control plans are developed based on the sector requirement, but it's not required in ISO 9001, right? On top of that, some OEMs will add a little bit more specificity on the control plans, such as GM, for example, asks in their customer-specific requirements document that when preparing the control plan, the sample sizes and frequencies shall be determined based on risk, occurrence of failure modes, and volume, right? So CSRs, there is no contradiction. It's just supplemental requirements to the sector, and IATF obviously are supplemental requirements, QMS requirements to ISO 9001. And when we talk about management system, again, the basics of management system, according to ISO 9000, is that first of all, we need a management system, right? Quality is the qualifier, right? We need a management system, a system that companies and business, they decided to organize. They decided to become organizations. And in becoming organizations, they establish their policies, the why, they establish their objectives, what the results they want to achieve, and processes to achieve those objectives. So it's a lot of standardization here on the basics of the management system. Obviously, quality management system, again, quality is the qualifier here, obviously looking to customer satisfaction. So where does requirements fit on this structure? Requirements will provide limits to the way we run our processes. So requirements will provide the what we need to consider when we run our purchasing process, our development process. So those are the way that we connect the dots between the QMS requirements and the QMS processes. So let's take a look at one example here as we are talking about interpreting QMS requirements, right? So IATF 6123, contingency plans, right? So I just wrote here extract on D, they say that the organization shall include as a supplement to the contingency plans, a notification process to the customer and other interested parties for the extent and duration of any situation impacting customer operations. So how to interpret requirements? We have a 3 steps methodology that we teach our customers. Is basically locate the action, right? Locate the verb, okay? Then understand the scope of the action. And finally, check for conditions. So in this case, what's the key action? Include in the contingency plan, right? What we are going to include? The notification process to the customer and other interested parties. Now, we need to include in the contingency plans this notification. And what are the conditions? So the conditions are about any situation impacting customer operations, right? So any situation that may impact customer operations needs to be part of this notification process. You see, the IATF will tell us what we need to do, right? The action is to include in the contingency plans a notification process to the customer and other interested parties, and the conditions are for situations impacting customer operations. Now, when we interpret CSRs, so let's just take an example here, Ford example on 6.123. Contingency plans, Ford supplemental requirements is saying the organization shall notify the Ford receiving plant, the buyer, and the STA engineer within 24 hours of the organization production interruption. The organization shall communicate the nature of the problem to Ford and take immediate actions to ensure supply of product to Ford. Now, let's apply the same methodology here. What is the action? Additional action from Ford? No, basically notification. But the scope of notification is now we do have specificity here. We have the Ford receiving plant, the buyer, and the STA engineer, right? So we need now who we need to notify here. And we have conditions within 24 hours of organization production interruption. So you see, it's narrowing a little bit more. There is no contradiction, again, but they are making their specifics clear by issuing their customer-specific requirement documents. The other action is to communicate the nature of the problem to Ford, right? And to take immediate actions to assure supply of products, right? So they're saying you notify these teams, you communicate the nature of the problem, and you take immediate actions. Now, if we compare IATF with CSRs, and again, here's just an example. What is the key point here? IATF typically will tell us what to do. Customer-specific requirements will tell us who is involved in this action, when this action needs to be implemented, how, sometimes how this action need to be implemented. So in this case, Ford is requiring a notification of production interruptions. Well, that's a little bit different for impacting customer operations. It's like being more proactive here, right? When you have a production interruption, you need to notify, right? So maybe it's like the potential impact of customer operations. That's their focus, being more proactive here, right? And they define the time frame and the people that needs to be involved in this communication. Okay, so to interpret requirements, what is the key point of interpreting CSR requirements? The same that we interpret IATF requirements. Identify the action, okay? Identify what needs to be done. Then identify the scope of the action. And finally, understand the conditions, the boundaries, what will trigger the action to be mandatory, okay? As applicable. Sometimes there is no condition, sometimes there are conditions, so we need to make sure that we understand that. So interpreting is really a big challenge for some organizations as they just try to read and not really reflect on what they are saying here. So understanding conditions, understanding the scope, and understanding what's the key action that is required is critical for this starting point. If you don't understand, if you don't interpret properly, then we have issues integrating into our CSR. And that's exactly our next step. So as we move from interpreting to integrating, if you have any questions about interpreting, please type into the Q&A, into the chat, and Maddie will help us at the end of this webinar. Okay, so we understand, we locate the action, we understand the scope, and then we understand the conditions where the CSR is mandatory. Now, how can we integrate the CSRs into our quality management system? Again, the hierarchy will help us to understand that if we do have a quality management system that is already addressing IATF 16949, we do have processes to address the IATF requirements. So what we need to do, we need just to think about if CSRs are supplemental to these requirements, we need to update exactly the same processes that are designed to address IATF requirements. So it's not a new system, it's just updating the current system that we have. So we have objectives and we have processes. And requirements are constraints, are limits on what we need to do regarding this process activities. When we add the customer specific requirements, we're basically adding a little bit more specificity on what activities are required in our process. So again, there is no contradiction. We need to align our processes with the requirements. Now, IATF has a variety of clauses or sections, if you will, that will refer or will open the door for customer specific requirements. Okay, so think about product safety, right? Approval of FMEAs and control plans. Think about 432. 432 is the core clause where they say that we need to evaluate and include CSRs in the scope. So that's the baseline clause for customer specific requirements. Or the competence of internal auditors, right? So how we ensure the competence of internal auditors and second party auditors regarding the applicable CSRs. Another core clause is the 7511, is where they talk about the quality manual that include a document indicating where applicable CSRs are addressed. So that's another core clause for us, understanding this integration. What processes will need to update based on the CSRs? You do have CSRs for special characteristics, for TPM, for layout inspection, the frequency of layout inspection, functional testing, internal audits. Absolutely, we need to audit CSRs, right? And so we need to integrate CSRs in our internal audits, all types of audits. And another variety here, this is just, not a comprehensive list, but it's just some of the linkages between CSRs and IATF requirements. Now, if you think about the CSR implementation as a process, right, what is expected? So we have at least 4 big stages here during our implementation, okay? So the first stage is to know the CSRs, is what we call CSRs inventory, right? Do we have a CSR owner, a person or group of people in your organization that is responsible to ensure that the inventory is accurate? This CSR owner or owners, are they collecting the current CSRs? Are they listing and documenting the CSRs and the scope of CSRs by customer, by product, by site, by location? Do they have a log revision status? When was the CSRs updated or not? So CSRs inventory, the first thing is to identify. Now, after identification, we need now to start the integration. We need to prepare a kind of document that will connect the dots between requirements and our processes, okay? So what customer and clause and are the impacted processes. Attention here, because sometimes we need to flow down CSRs to suppliers. So where applicable, we need to include in our matrix the flow down of CSRs to suppliers. Now, when we have the matrix done, now it's time for our gap analysis. So it's a kind of self-assessment where we check how we are in terms of addressing this customer-specific requirements, right? We evaluate the resources needed, the competence needed, right? The training needed, everything that will be like an obstacle or that will avoid a proper implementation. And the point here on the CSR matrix is really to make sure we understand the connection between the customer-specific requirements and the impacted processes, and the process owners are aware of this. Now, the third stage would be to update the QMS. Here, we need to decide how to address each gap. Are we going to plan for full compliance, right? Are we seeking for waivers? Or are we phasing in like a staged approach, obviously with customer agreement? Everything here is customer agreement because we need to comply with all CSRs, right? So how we're going to address each one. So that's the first decision. The second one, based on that, will be to update our system. So update documented information to include the CSRs, update our systems. As much as possible, we want to have systems that will enforce conformity to CSRs, right? And obviously train all affected roles in the CSRs as applicable, right? So we update our system. Now we are not done. We need to check if these CSRs are effectively implemented. And the tool that we are using for that is performing internal audits. So we're performing internal audits to evaluate the conformance to CSRs. If we find any gaps at this moment now, we need to implement and evaluate corrective actions effectiveness regarding these CSRs. So CSR's implementation is really a process. Another way to show this process is like using our old friend, the turtle diagram, right? Think about CSR's implementation as a process. So what are the inputs? The customers, they need their customer-specific requirements to be effectively implemented. What is the output? Well, the CSRs are effectively implemented in a timely manner from the date of their publication. So that's really the goal of our process. Now, how can we measure this process? So we can measure this process by implementing the CSRs within the defined time frame, again, agreed with the customer. And if we have findings, non-conformity findings during our internal audits, for example, that's another way to ensure the effectiveness of this process. Now, how do we do this process? We have a couple of documented information to perform this process. We can use a traceability matrix. We can have a gap analysis. We can have action plans. And we need also procedures to flow down applicable CSRs. So those are the methods that we use to implement this process. What are the resources that we need? Well, we need customer portals, IATF website for the OEMs. That's the place to go for automotive OEM CSR documents. And also we need our systems, right? Our systems to enforce CSR's completion as much as possible. Who is involved? The owner of the CSR, but also an implementation team according to the action plan. A critical interface here are the customers. So we need to have a communication channel with the customers to ensure that our implementation process is robust. Now, an example, right? So suppose you have here management review. So how are we going to integrate this Stellantis into my management review process? My management review process, gathering all the requirement inputs, review data, and decide on improvement areas. So I have as inputs to review the effectiveness of the QMS, including customer satisfaction. As an output, the effectiveness is reviewed, corrective actions, improvement actions are effectively implemented. So that's the big picture of a management review, right? And we do have the way we measure the effectiveness of the management review. We have procedures for management review. We have resources that we need for management review, and we have people involved in the management review. But now, when we look into this Stellantis CSRs, right? Let's take a look here on this example. Stellantis is saying each year, Stellantis sets quality targets for the supplier. In this case here, supplier is the organization, okay? The supplier must incorporate these objectives into its yearly improvement plan. The supplier must implement analysis and action plans to achieve these goals and include their own suppliers in this analysis. The quality objectives shall be cascaded to the sub-suppliers and must be consistent with Stellantis targets. Wow, they're talking about now yearly targets defined by Stellantis that the organization needs to consider And beyond that, that they need to flow down applicable quality objectives to their suppliers, what they call here sub-suppliers. Okay, when I look to the management review, how do I integrate? So as a process owner, I need to understand what activities I need to change. Are there new resources needed? Are there new persons involved in this process? Do I need to change anything in the way I measure the performance of this process? So that's really what the process owner should be doing, understanding what are the updates. So you don't have a management review for CSRs and management review. You are incorporating the CSRs into your management review. That's what we're calling integrating CSRs. Okay, so an example here, after reviewing these requirements, what the process owner could do, in this case, the top management. Okay, our resource, the quality objective dashboard, we need to update the system to make sure we have annual updates based on Stellantis target. So we need to update our quality objectives dashboard. We need to update our management review procedure because now we need to align this new input in our procedure. We need to ensure corrective actions and improvement action plans are based on this annual updated from Stellantis. And also we will need to ensure a procedure to flow down objectives to sub-suppliers, right? So this is the example on how they are integrating a management review process to this requirement. Now, again, this is just an example, but if you want to organize this implementation, what is the best tool that you could use? Okay, according to our opinion, the best tool will be a traceability matrix, okay? A traceability matrix will list all of your customers, all of their CSRs, and the applicable IATF clauses, right? Who is the owner for each of their CSRs? Where is that applicable in your organization? What the product lines and sites, locations, and so on, right? And then the connection between the CSR, each CSR with the QMS processes. Again, this is just an example. So we provided here a couple of processes. So contract review, design, production, purchasing, and management review. But you can have like 12, 20 columns here. Every single process may be impacted by CSRs. So in this case, for example, Ford in June 2025, that's their document. The item in their document is 6123, which is the same mirroring the IATF clause. This is the owner, Mr. Keller. That's applicability will affect all the Ford lines. Their location is Baltimore. And this contingency plan is not affecting, at this moment, contract review process, design process, but it is affecting production, purchasing, and management review. Okay, so that's the beginning of your correlation matrix, what we are calling here CSR's traceability matrix. Okay, now, as a self-assessment, what you want to do, you want to understand, do we have any gap here? Are our procedures, are our resources, are our team aligned and aware of these requirements? Are we doing this? So that's a self-assessment. You don't need even an internal audit. You can just do a self-assessment by the process owners to understand the gaps. So they're going to list their gaps. And in this case, in this example, they have unclear criteria for impacting situations. So the contingency plan and what the process owners are defining here, we don't have a clear criteria for impacting situations. So we need to do a better job here in our, what triggers a contingency plan preparation. So how we're going to integrate this? So we have a gap. So what we need to do, we need to update documentation, systems, and training. So we need to update our risk management procedure. We need to align our ERP system, ERP log to critical issues. So we need to make that more automation here, okay? And we need to train all involved employees in these three processes. How we are there. So here you have a legend here with the status. So no gap identified. Red, everything is open. Yellow, waiver. Why waiver is yellow? Because waiver, you're not in compliance with the customer requirements. So it's a yellow because you should try to, in the future, fulfill this gap, even if the customer is waiving that for at this moment. Orange, a phased-in approach, a staged approach, so we can implement here and then we move to the full completion. So something that you have agreement with your customer. And green, fully implemented. Again, this is just an example, okay? So in this case, for example, suppose there are supplier interruptions that are reported by phone by their suppliers, but did not trigger the 24 hours clock. So the 24 hours clock according to Ford CSRs. So in production is working, but when the interruption is coming from our supplier production, is more kind of informal. So we really need to update the ERP, whatever is the ERP system there, SAP, Oracle, to trigger this 24 hours clock. So, and this is outstanding. So we have, for now, we have a manual process, but in the future, we'll have the fully effective process that we consider that's the ERP triggering that update. Okay, that notification. Now, integrating, right? So if you have any questions about integrating, it's your time. You can type your questions and we're going to cover at the end of the webinar. Now, we're moving from integrating to maintaining. Though it's simple, this is where some organizations, I would say, they struggle, okay? Why they struggle? Because it's so simple, but it's so hard. So how to maintain CSRs? So basically, you did the long run is really to make sure the CSRs are effectively implemented as we saw before. But maintaining is like ongoing, right? How we keep our internal audits covering all CSRs, how we qualify our internal auditors to make sure the CSRs are covered, how we have in our audit program a coverage of all applicable CSRs, right? How we follow up with corrective actions from these audits. And especially the ongoing process where we monitor the CSR changes. So, you know, yearly, usually, or every couple of years, the CSRs, they change. Some customers, they change twice a year. So we must have an ongoing process to verify changes to CSRs, and then going all the way back to updating our inventory, our matrix, update our system, and audit for effective implementation. It's a kind of PDCA cycle here, right? So though it's simple, it's hard because now it's not a project, it's a process. A project is something that has start and finish. A process is a never-ending activity. So that's the reason we are stressing here the idea of CSR's implementation and CSR's maintenance must be a process. Otherwise, we have all this hard work, huge workload. You update everything 2 months later. Oh, the customer changed it. Now, if you don't have an ongoing process to monitor that, and going back to the stage one there, where you have an owner, when you prepare the matrix, you identify the gaps. So then over time, your CSR's implementation will not be effective. Okay, simple but hard. So how to do it? Again, you can just use the traceability matrix, right? So suppose you update in June and in July, Stellantis changed their requirements. So now we're selling to Stellantis. You know what? Let's use the same template. So Stellantis now has new requirements about quality objectives. You do the same job. You verify the processes needed, process impacted, and you work from there, right? So for the contingency plans, for example, Ford is impacting production, purchasing, and management review. For the quality objectives is impacting purchasing and management review. And you have your rationale here of the gaps. And in this case, you are really not in the mark. You have everything is really open. So you can use the matrix to make sure top management, process owners are aware of outstanding implementation. Right? And then obviously implementing the action plans, the improvement plans, the corrective actions. So maintaining, it's simple, but it's hard. It's part of your system that you need to go back and say, do we have an ongoing process to check customer portals, to check IATF website. By the way, IATF Global Oversight website has a subscription functionality that you can be notified for any changes. So that's a very nice tool for you to make sure the trigger is there, right? But if you have other customers, you need also to ensure you're checking their customer portals and to comply with their revised CSRs. So we talk about interpreting, we talk about integrating, and we talk about maintaining, right? Maintaining most of the times is hard because it's an evolving, it's a never ending, and must be a process. So as an auditor, how are you going to audit this? So now we move to the final stage. I want to spend a little bit more time here, talk with you about how to audit this, because without proper auditing, we will never ensure that the CSRs are effectively implemented. Now, so how to audit CSRs? Okay, so let's go back a little bit and understand the competence in audit CSRs according to the IATF Auditor Guide. Very important document, strongly recommended for all the automotive supply chain to have the IATF Auditor Guide 5th edition, because they explain the certification process, they explain the competence. It's really a very helpful tool for qualifying, align the qualification of internal auditors and supplier auditors to this tool. One of the competencies is the core tools, okay? And what they say about core tools, they say that what is expected for a quality management system auditor is that they need to demonstrate that the customer-specific requirements are integrated into a process-based audit. Wow. That's not asking, do you have GM CSR document? Yes. Do you implement GM CSR document? Yes. Do you have Stellantis CSR document? Yes. Can you show me how you implement? It is not a checklist driven, it is a process driven. So the auditor must be able to visualize what processes are impacted by the CSRs. And when they are auditing these processes, they are going to sample customer-specific requirements. So let's take a look here. Effectively audit the client processes for gathering, communicating, and implementing CSRs. Wow, that's really, everything we need to know in a nutshell here. Gathering, okay? How we identify CSRs. You see, they are more concerned about the process. They're not concerned about that you check every single shell and every single detail. They're checking, do you have a robust process to identify? Do you have a robust process that will be communicating with the applicable owners what requirements are applicable to their processes? And do you have a process to ensure effective implementation? Okay, so gathering, communicating, and implementing. That's the core competence for auditors. So we will help process owners to see the gaps that they haven't. So if you go back here, they say we are all good. Suppose they turn this into green. Now it's time for an internal audit, and this internal audit will audit the applicable processes, okay, the impacted processes, and we will evaluate for effective implementation, how you gather, how you communicate, and how you implement this. Now, they describe key skills for auditors when auditing CSRs, okay? 1, verify the client has a defined process for the identification of CSRs, okay? So you see, they are looking for a process to identify. They're not looking for a list of customer-specific requirements, because you prepare the list this month, next month is obsolete. So, but do you have a process to identify? So do you have a process that the current revision level of the requirements are updated? In other words, ongoing, right? So that's where you start your audit. And then they say, incorporate into a process-based audit samples of relevant customer-specific requirements. Well, what are relevant customer-specific requirements? Relevant to the processes that are part of the scope of your audit. okay? And they say for the IATF auditor guide, focusing on IATF OEM members. Now, pay attention here, focusing on IATF OEM customers, but not limited to them. So if you are a tier 2 organization or a tier 3 organization and you're not supplying anything to IATF OEM customers, do you have customer specific requirements applicable to your tier? Yes. Check with your tier 2 customers. Okay. So the IATF auditor guide is telling especially CB auditors, certification body auditors, to focus on IATF OEM customers, but it's not limited to. Okay. And audit the process to ensure the customer requirements are identified, addressed, and maintained. So that's the competence we are looking for. Question: are your internal auditors competent according to these skills? That's important for you to reflect. Because again, customer-specific requirements are the specificities that can make or break customer satisfaction. They are there because they have an intent. They are there based on the lessons learned of each OEM and say, hey, I need more specificity here. Why? Lessons learned. Typically, lessons learned. Okay? So how to audit the CSRs? Based on this competence, provide a framework on how to audit the CSRs. So we have a 3 steps framework here. And again, this is a suggestion, is not written anywhere. It's just a way for you to visualize the process. And the first one is exactly visualize. So we say, if you want to audit CSRs for effective implementation, visualize the context where the CSR is applied. So start by visualizing the sequence of typical activities rather than just jumping straight into a checklist style question, such as, do you notify your customers about any situation impacting their operations, right? So you know that this is a customer notification CSR, but try to visualize the sequence of typical activities. Try to visualize the context where this requirement is applied, okay? So in this case, for example, what is the context of contingency plans? First of all, they need to define what are the critical manufacturing processes and infrastructure. By critical, I mean essential for production, right? For each critical or essential for production equipment or manufacturing process, they need to identify risks, internal and external. So this can become risks coming from the supply chain. So they identify risks for each type of critical equipment or infrastructure that can cause production interruption. And then they define contingency plans. Definition of contingency plans will be based on the risks, right? So here they say what needs to be done. But IATF goes beyond. They say prepare. So IATF is saying, I don't want an overview. Oh, if this key equipment is broken, just use another supplier. Outsource. No, that's the definition. Now we need to prepare specific contingency measures, right? What supplier? Is the supplier qualified? Do you have PPAP for all these components that you eventually will outsource based on this machine, downtime, excessive downtime, key equipment downtime? So prepare specific contingency plans. Make the plan ready to use. And then include a notification process as part of your contingency plan. So that's the baseline IATF requirement where, for example, Ford requirement will be applicable. So if you look, going back to Ford requirement, they say, well, if within 24 hours, notify buyer, STA, and Ford receiving plant. And communicate the nature of the problem and take immediate actions to assure supply to Ford. So that's the additional requirement. So what is the step to identify the impacted activity by the CSRs? So, okay, understood. The key activity is notification. So notification is a critical activity that is impacted by the CSR. Now you move to the third step. Now you can sample. So determine different types of sampling when auditing CSRs. So we define here 3, but there are a variety of approaches here. But these are three very common sampling approaches that you may want to take when auditing the effective implementation. Number one, simple, output sampling. So records of completed activities. Review documented evidence that the CSR-driven activity was executed. Well, in our case here for contingency plans, just ask for examples where customer notifications were completed. So ask for customer notification log, verify that notifications were sent within 24 hours to Ford receiving plant, buyer, and STA engineer. In other words, right, this is the key activity I want to check. Show me evidence here, the notification to Ford, okay? That's the sampling approach number one. Another important approach when sampling CSRs for effective implementation is to understand the trigger point. Remember, most of the CSRs, they will have conditions when this happened, as applicable, when that happened. So understand the trigger point sampling. What are the events or the criteria? One of the most important things for us to understand is this word criteria. As most of the requirements are risk-based, you want to check what's their criteria to notify customers. What's their criteria to consider a production interruption? If they have the wrong criteria, well, the IT law, trash in, trash out. You're never going to notify if they have a poor criteria to identify production interruption. So sample events or situations that should be have triggered the CSRs. Example, ask for the criteria used to classify key equipment. So suppose they have just one robot, and this robot that is used for Ford, they are not considering downtime as a production interruption. Well, their criteria to classify key equipment is not effective. Because if they have just this robot and the Ford product lines are designed in their flow chart to use this robot, you cannot just move from automation to manual assembly because this is the approved process. So this is a key equipment. Now, ask for the criteria. Review records of significant events, downtime, supply chain issues, and verify how the 24 hours clock was started. Check whether Ford was notified, and if not, confirm the rationale. In other words, you sampling the output by reviewing a notification to Ford, but you can also go all the way back and say, how do you consider key equipment for Ford? How identify the risks for Ford? What are the contingency plans to address these risks? So what triggers the notification is the production interruption. And if they don't have a clear criteria of production interruption, they may just show you a couple of examples, but not have a robust system to address Ford CSRs. And finally, live sampling, right? Interview and observations. As you are there, go to the Gemba, check what's going on, and follow up audit trail. So basically, conduct interviews, observations, walk through shop floors to see how the CSRs apply it in real time. So identify, for example, potential supply chain bottlenecks, right? Single source suppliers, overseas suppliers. Verify whether the organization has flowed down the requirement to notify in case of production interruption. Confirm how they monitor supplier compliance to this requirement. So that's another way. So 3 ways, approaches to sample CSRs. First, output sampling. So go directly to the activity where the CSR is connected and ask for records, follow-up records. What are your customer log for notification? Second, try to understand criteria that triggers the mandatory activity. Again, most of the requirements, they do have conditions, and if the condition is not met, the requirement is not mandatory. So understand that. There's a huge cause of conflict during audits because auditors, they consider everything is applied every time. So understand the criteria and then go back to understand what triggers that. Okay, what's the criteria? And do they have an effective criteria? And finally, live sampling. Go to the Gemba and check for issues that could cause production interruption in this case. But archetypical will be output sampling, trigger point sampling, and live sampling, regardless of the CSRs that you're auditing. Okay, so we reached the mark of almost 50 minutes, and now we move to a final poll.
Yes, luckily this poll only has one question for you guys. So it's just going to be a recap of what we've covered today. So based on what this webinar covered, what do you find to be the most consistent struggle in complying with CSRs? So these are obviously the 5 different phases. So I'll give you guys maybe another 20, 30 seconds here to answer. So far, it's looking like phase 5 is winning the majority here. Give you guys just another couple seconds so we can make sure we've got everybody who wants to answering the poll. All right, and here are results. So it does look like, yeah, about 44% of you said phase 5. So Vivone, you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, yes. So maintaining, I was expecting that also. Maintaining is a big deal because this is a living system. When we are implementing IATF, we have a task force, we have the certification, the stage 2 audit, everything is like everybody is engaged. But for maintaining, we need the same level of commitment, not the same workload, but there is a workload there for maintaining, updating the system as a living system. So I was expecting that also, but it's nice for people saying also interpret and integrate as potential struggles. So very good, very good.
Great, thank you guys. All right, so now we have some time for some Q&A. So let's start with some of the questions we've got. One of the ones we received about halfway through says, integration needs more than just a procedure update. You have to engage stakeholders and overcome any resource constraints associated with the new requirement. Is there a way to make this more efficient?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Let me just go back there. Integration is not about just update documents. We need to check systems, train people, understand the resources we need, understand the team, the owner, the stakeholders for this, all process owners. So very good comment. Yes, we are aligned. Integration is not, okay, I update my procedure. No, that's not the way to do. Integration requires a team effort involving process owners, involving systems, training, not only documented information. Good.
Great. Okay, let's see. Towards the beginning, somebody wanted to know specifically about how to deal with Stellantis CSR. Old became invalid January 7th of this year, but had to be applied for projects before that date.
Well, that's the CSR. That's the reason I'm going to keep the CSR traceability matrix here to make sure we communicate with our customers. So the very first question would be legacy, right? So people say, what about legacy CSRs if we're applying this particular CSRs, they change the revision. Do we need to go back and revert the old product lines and everything to comply with? In general, I would say yes, because CSRs are more generic QMS requirements, but you always want to communicate with your customer if something really hurts or is really hard to be implemented right away. Typically, CSRs are just quality management system requirements, so they're going to update your process going forward. But you may have cases where you have legacy impact, where you need to revise, previous activities that were performed. So always communicate with your customer to have the final call on legacy issues. That's what we call legacy issues, right? They update so they launch a new requirement for control plans, and now you don't need to reveal all the control plans for legacy products. That's a good question for your customers to align this with your customers.
Great, thank you. We've got another here. CSRs can sometimes generate significant impacts in terms of human and financial resources, which were not anticipated in the initial project budget. In such cases, who should bear these additional costs? The IATF 16949 standard does not seem to provide a clear framework on this matter.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, CSRs are customer requirements, so it needs to be reviewed and agreed. So the point of financial impact, at least we can branch this into two conversations. First of all, sometimes is the way we see how to implement that is really very hard. So the way we see sometimes we see that the requirement will cost us a lot because we just have a one way to do it. So that's the first question we need to ask. Do we have a clear path on how this is aligned with our current processes and how this can benefit our processes? So instead of just looking to the cost, trying to look to the benefits, beyond that, try to look on how can we implement this to simplify, to lean our processes. So that's another approach. So that's the first branch. I would say stage one will be, okay, what are the benefits? Remember, CSRs are there because of this lessons learned for the automotive industry. But absolutely, there are cases that this may impact your current costs because you don't have the resources needed to fulfill with that requirement. And that's the reason you need to communicate with your customers. Explain the rationale, how you're going to stage, why the intent of this requirement can be fulfilled with a different practice that is not necessarily comply 100% of the time with the CSRs. Again, that's the communication side, but I would not recommend you to talk with your customer before reflecting and interpreting with the CSRs and really having this very hard question. Why we think that this is really very costly? Why? What are the benefits? What's the intent here? Again, quality management system is all about cost, benefits, and risk. Okay, so we are in an industry that warranty costs are huge. So most of the CSRs are there to protect everybody in the supply chain, including end users, to avoid huge disruptions, financial disruptions. So think about this stage one first. Let's understand the benefits. Let's understand how we can implement this in a more lean, less cost-intensive approach that will fulfill the requirement. But then on stage two, say, okay, we got our ideas. We interpret properly the requirements. Let's talk with the customer our ideas on how to comply with this partially or a different approach that we can agree with our customers.
Great, thanks. We've got time for a couple more. Here we have any thoughts on tier two organizations regarding negotiating CSRs before accepting, especially for commercial off-the-shelf products? Are waivers needed from the customer when it is their choice to buy commercial off the shelf?
Yeah, again, regardless of the level you are in the supply chain, the agreement with the customer about their CSRs. And remember, we need to differentiate customer-specific requirements than customer requirements, right? Customer-specific requirements, the IATF OEM, they are doing a good job clarifying and connecting the dots between the CSRs and IATF clauses. Okay, not necessarily a supplier manual will be a customer-specific requirement. Why? If the supplier manual has product requirements, technical requirements, logistic requirements, this may be applicable only for this new program. So it's your job to sort in your tier two, tier one supplier manual or other terms and conditions what are real the customer specific requirements. So the first stage, I would say sort. Some are contractual requirements, technical requirements that are applicable only for that particular part number or program that you're developing. In this case, it's part of your contract review process. CSRs are more generic, are more quality management system driven. And sometimes as you go down in the supply chain, this is not so clear in their documented information flow down to suppliers. They just combine everything in the supplier manual, supplier handbook, but not everything that is there is a customer specific requirement. According to IATF definition, are just supplemental requirements to IATF requirements. Okay.
Great. And let's take one more. We've got who is expected to be the owner of CSRs in the organization? Should it be sales, top management, QMR?
I would say top management will review in the management review the effective implementation of CSRs. The owner will be typically the core process impacted. So for these in these examples that we have here, the quality objectives for sure top management. top management should be the owner, because one of the requirements from Stellantis is the year quality objectives, align your targets with their targets, flow down to supplier. That's a high level top management task, right? For contingency plans, maybe it will be the quality manager that is taking care of how to deploy risk management to each process owner. It will depend, but there is no one size fits all. But for sure, we need to have this assigned to managers, to leadership, to make sure leaders are the core impacted processes are accountable to implementing. And that's the reason it's a task force. Is the same thing. Consider this as like when you're implementing IATF, right? If you say, okay, this technician is responsible for everything, that's usually not going to fly well, because you need managerial support. So usually the owners will be managers that will oversee the activity, and will set up working teams, task force teams to implement the requirement.
Great. All right, let's just get some final notes out of the way here before we wrap up. So for all attendees of this webinar, we are offering a 15% discount code when we email you the on-demand version of the webinar. So you can expect that within the next couple days. So for our new Applying GM Ford and Stellantis CSRs to IATF 16949 2025 edition, that next session is going to be October 17th. That is a live virtual session. So that discount code will be included when we send you that email. And then we just wanted to let you know that we have lots of other stuff that you can access. You can visit our website at plexusintl.com for our blog, as well as a full view of our catalog, as well as tools. We also are on YouTube at PlexusINTL. That's where this webinar and all previous and future webinars will be uploaded. And then you can also visit us on LinkedIn at Plexus International. So thank you everybody for attending. This was super great. Thank you, Vivone, for giving us a really great speech today and taking us through all of this. Everybody, we would super appreciate it if you could take the very short final survey after this. We really value any feedback that you can provide us with. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Bye.